Okay. All right, here we are again. Thank you so much for joining everyone for another collaborative webinar between AgLanta Grown and University of Georgia's Cooperative Extension. We are here. Oh, I'm sorry, let me present here. Oh, here we go. We are here tonight discussing integrated pest management. Last week, we had a really robust webinar discussing entomology and the different types of bug and bug identification. We had a great lesson from Gabrielle LaTora, the Fulton County Extension agent, and it was mind-blowing, all the different characteristics of bugs. So now this week, we'll figure out how to identify the pests and hopefully get rid of them. So without further ado, I'd like to go in. As the AgLanta program, we start our webinars and educational offerings out with a grounding and acknowledgement of the land, territories, practices, and cultures of the indigenous peoples, forcibly removed First Nations. Here in Atlanta is the Muskogee Creek people, the enslaved people of the African diaspora, and the countless migrants and immigrants who are largely the laborers in the current agriculture workforce today. We'd also like to uplift all people of the global majority, aka the Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, or BIPOC, as some people say, as well as other individuals, groups, populations, and cultures that continue to show up and represent for equitable, just, inclusive, and anti-racist communities and practices for all of us to benefit here in Atlanta and beyond. And lastly, we would like to show respect and gratitude and support to all humankind and living beings in the intersecting and overlapping social identities and factors such as gender identity, caste, sexual orientation, race, class, religion, disability, physical appearance, and height. And this grounding and acknowledgement was written by our urban ag director here at the City of Atlanta, J. Olu Bayowu, and we'd be remiss if we did not mention a quote by the Honorable Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King: "No one is free until we are all free." And then lastly, I wanted to get into just, introduction of our team, just for everyone's knowledge. Here at the Urban Ag Food Systems team in the City of Atlanta, also known as AgLanta, we like to say we're real accessible people. So you give us a call, send us an email. You're not going to be talking to Chat GPT or any AI, anything like that. So our Urban Ag Director, J. Olu Bayowu, as well as myself, Justin Nicholson. I'm the AgLanta Grown Program Coordinator here at the City of Atlanta. Yesenia Maldonado is representing our team as well as the Assistant Program Coordinator. And we have Elizabeth Beek joining us today on our team, who is our Food Systems Planner, who's assisting on some back end. And we have two fellows, Amina Robinson and Whitney Barr, as well as Michelle Wiseman, who handles our food waste and reduction campaigns. So without further ado, I'd like to pass the mic over to Gabrielle LaTora of Fulton County Extension. And let me stop sharing.
Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. Let me go ahead and share mine. All right. Can everybody see?
Yes.
All right. Perfect. So if you were here for last week's webinar, thank you so much for coming back. And if you are new this round, thank you for coming. We're going to talk about some basics of integrated pest management, also called IPM, which is kind of a framework. It's a way of approaching pest management. And so we're going to go over a lot of concepts, not a ton of specific, this is how you manage this pest type of information, but more about how to approach pest management in this more sustainable and resilient way. So I'm Gabrielle LaTora. I am the Agriculture and Natural Resources Agent for UGA Extension in Fulton County. And also in the webinar, we have Norlethia Harris. She is our Agriculture and Natural Resources Educator in Fulton County. And she's also going to be assisting with some of the questions in the chat. So if you have questions that come up throughout the webinar, feel free to put them in the chat and Norlethia will answer them, or we will tackle them at the end of the talk. All right, let's get into it. Okay, so what is integrated pest management? This quote came from my IPM textbook that I used in college, and they say that IPM is an ecosystem-based strategy that focuses on long-term prevention of pests or their damage through a combination of techniques such as biological control, habitat manipulation, modification of cultural practices, and the use of resistant varieties. And we're going to talk about all of these things, but the takeaway here is through a combination of techniques. So the IPM, or integrated pest management, is a multi-pronged approach to managing pests. And when I use the term pests, I'm talking about a few different things. I'm talking about insects, which is what this talk is going to focus on mostly, but also weeds are considered pests, and plant diseases and the pathogens that cause them are considered pests as well. So we want to be suppressing or preventing any of these pest organisms using multiple different tools. So we like to call this the many little hammers approach. So every control tactic that we have or preventative measure is a little hammer, and when we use them all together, that's going to be a more resilient approach to managing pests versus using one big hammer, which we often think of as being pesticides. So we have a lot of different tools in the toolbox. These are our little hammers, and we're going to get into them in detail. So we've got resistant plant varieties that are either resistant or tolerant to certain pests. We've got biological control. These are other organisms that will kill our pests for us. We've got cultural controls. These are things that we can do to make the environment less favorable for pests. Mechanical and physical controls are things that we do to physically keep pests off of whatever plant we're trying to grow. And we do have pesticides as a tool in the toolbox. And I'll go into this in depth, but under the IPM approach, we want to use pesticides after we've exhausted all the other preventative and non-chemical methods. We want to use narrow spectrum insecticides that are just going to target the pest insect that we want to target. And we want to use pesticides very judiciously. So it is a tool in the toolbox, but we want to use it responsibly. These are sort of the core components of the integrated pest management framework. So the first is pest identification. This is super, super, super important because you have to correctly identify your pest for whatever sort of control actions you take to be effective. We don't want to incorrectly identify our pest and then take some sort of control action and have it not work, because then we're wasting time and money, we're wasting resources, we're potentially introducing chemicals into the environment that don't need to be introduced. So pest identification is really important in IPM. Then we move on to preventative things. So once we have identified, yes, this is a pest in the system, or this is potentially a pest in our system, we can take a lot of actions that will make that environment less favorable for pests to sort of take a foothold. So we've got a lot of preventative tools. And then we want to be monitoring on a regular basis. So we want to be out there scouting our plants. Excuse me. We want to be flipping over the leaves. We can use things like traps, whether they're baited or not. We want to be out there looking at the different pests and pest populations that are in the system. And there's more and less scientific ways to do this, but it is sort of regular monitoring is a core concept in IPM. And then we have our control actions. So we want to evaluate which control actions are going to be appropriate for pests that we have in the system. And we want to choose based on what's going to be the most effective and least harmful. And then we will take our actions. So we have all those many little hammers. And then evaluation is a really, really important part of this framework, because we want to take detailed notes about what we saw, when we saw it, where we saw it, what control action we decided to take, and whether it worked, so that we can use that information in the future. So, as I said, pest sort of has a lot of different definitions, but in general, a pest is something that either competes with humans or animals or the plants that we're trying to grow for food or water. something that injures humans, our animals, our plants, our structures, or our possessions. A pest can be something that spreads disease to humans or our animals, or something that just annoys us. You know, there are plenty of things that we consider pests that are not medically significant. We just consider them to be an annoyance. So when you're out there looking at your pests, monitoring who's in your garden or on your farm, you want to take stock of a few different features. And I'm using the brown marmorated stink bug as an example for this. So we want to note the physical features of the pest. So in this case, we want to know what a brown marmorated stink bug looks like. And for those of y'all who were in the insect identification webinar last week, you'll remember that stink bugs are true bugs or hemipterans. So they have a lot of things in common. They've got this upside down triangle scutellum as adults. They have eyes that are sort of wide set on either side of their head. They all have piercing, sucking mouth parts, which I went on and on and on about. But all of these things are important for identifying this pest. We also want to know its development and biology. So we know that true bugs have incomplete metamorphosis. So they start off as like miniature versions of the adults, and at each molt, they get more and more adult-like. So we want to understand their development and the biology and ecology of the pests that we have in our system. We also want to know what kind of damage they cause. So being piercing, sucking insects, stink bugs are going to leave this sort of mottling, almost like blotchy pattern on tomatoes. This is really characteristic of stink bug damage on tomatoes. Excuse me. And that's because their mouths are shaped like needles. So all they can do is pierce a plant or a leaf or a stem or a fruit and suck out the contents from those cells, leaving sort of white or, you know, cloudy patches where they've sucked out the cell contents. So if you see something that's been chewed, like leaf material has physically been removed, it can't possibly be a stink bug. So that's important to know what kind of damage it causes. Is this a continuous pest? Is it something that shows up year after year after year and you know that it's going to be there every season? Is it an occasional pest? Maybe it just shows up, you know, every other year, every few years, depending on different environmental factors. Or is it a potential pest? Maybe it has been recently introduced and you know that it's coming, but it's not here yet, like spotted lanternfly. Maybe y'all have heard of spotted lanternfly. Or maybe it's, you know, a once in 10 years type of pest. So we want to know how likely are we to see this pest from year to year? And then what is our goal for control or action? Do we want to prevent the pest? Do we want to do things just to stave them off or make the environment less conducive for them? Do we want to suppress them? Maybe we already have a population that's causing damage and we want to knock down that population. A third option is eradication, and I'll talk about this in a few slides. Eradication means complete removal of whatever this insect is. Typically, eradication is not really a feasible option, but maybe it is for an introduced pest that we're trying to completely eradicate. So thinking about what level of control we want to get out of our actions is also going to be important. And then I want you to ask yourself, do I actually need to control this pest? When you see the pest, think about, is this pest actually causing harm, or is it expected to cause harm? Maybe it's feeding on the plant, but it's not really going to have an impact on yield, or it's not feeding on the fruit, which might be the marketable part of the plant. So an example is the other day I saw these carpet beetles on my chamomile plants in my garden, and maybe you've seen these tiny little guys in your house before. That's why they're called carpet beetles, because sometimes they live in the carpet. They're not usually a pest. You might see one a year, but they're not doing anything on this chamomile. They're literally just feeding from all these little flowers. They're pollinating, basically. So even though they're out there, they're interacting with the plant, I'm not really considering them a pest because they're not doing any harm to whatever marketable part of the plant. You know, if I wanted to sell and dry these chamomile leaves. These carpet beetles aren't really having an impact. Is the pest likely to cause harm, but is it at or below a level that's acceptable for you? So that example would be aphids on lots of different plants, including something like chrysanthemum. At a low level, yes, they're going to be feeding on the plant, but maybe the plant will still produce good yield, good blooms, and that's acceptable to us. But once that pest reaches a certain population, then that damage becomes unacceptable to us. So when you see a pest out there, get to know it, get to know what it does, and is that interaction with the plant going to be acceptable for you given your system? Okay, so I mentioned these pest control goals. Again, prevention is keeping a pest from becoming a problem by doing some things ahead of time, which is a great thing to do. We'll talk about that in length. Maybe suppression is your goal. So reducing pest numbers or damage to a level that's acceptable to you and your system, or complete eradication. Eradication might be a feasible goal inside your house. So eradicating termites is something that we want to do. We don't want to have any termites in our house. But when we're talking about a garden or a farmscape, eradication becomes not really a feasible option. So I would encourage you to figure out what level of different pest populations you're willing to tolerate, simply because complete eradication, the nuclear option, typically is just not really going to work out. So we have this huge concept in IPM, which is thresholds. And this is your level of tolerance for a certain insect population. IPM likes to come up with lots of different terms for different thresholds, but the one I want you to know is the action threshold. And this is the pest density, so the number of insect pests at which some sort of action should be taken in order to prevent harm or economic loss to your plants. So if you look at this graph, I'm going to walk you through it. We've got time on the x-axis, so we're moving through time. As we go through time, the number of insects is increasing. This is our action threshold. So if we take some sort of action right here, the pest population goes back down. If we don't do anything, the pest population would continue to rise to this point at which we are experiencing economic losses. So we're experiencing lower yields, we're experiencing maybe aesthetic damage that makes our products less marketable or less profitable. So this is our action threshold, the number of pests at which we want to do something to prevent the population from getting to a point where we're losing money. But it's not just money. This applies to gardeners as well. Maybe you're just doing it for fun. Aesthetics is really important in this. You know, I think the example I like to use is the Atlanta Botanical Garden. They might have a lower aesthetic threshold, meaning fewer insects will meet their threshold because they have very, very high aesthetic standards, because that's their business, for these plants to look good. Versus a home gardener, you might have a higher aesthetic threshold. You can tolerate more damage, aesthetic damage to your plants, because you're just doing it for fun. It's in your backyard. You're not really making money off of it. A commercial grower might also have sort of high aesthetic standards for their produce. You know, if their clientele knows that they have flawless produce, their action threshold, the number of insects where they need to do something, is going to be way lower than somebody that will tolerate more aesthetic damage. So when you are coming up with your own thresholds, I want you to think about what level of aesthetic damage and yield loss can I tolerate. Your action threshold is also going to depend on the health of your plant. So a strong plant is a healthy plant, and that's a resistant plant. So a healthy plant can tolerate more insects feeding on it and still produce the same yield or same output. Your aesthetic threshold your action threshold will also depend on your economic situation. Like I mentioned, if you're relying on these products, on this yield for your livelihood, you're probably going to have a lower action threshold than somebody who's just doing it for fun. And so the way that we know if we are approaching or have surpassed our thresholds is through monitoring. This is another really important concept in IPM. So we want to be out there looking at our plants, observing what insects are there, identifying them. So we want to know what kinds of pests do we have out there? How many individual pests do we have? And this doesn't have to be super scientific. It doesn't have to be like we have exactly 72 cabbage loopers or whatever. It can be we have twice as many in the same area as we did yesterday. It can be as scientific as you want. The more precise you get, the better you will be able to sort of quantify that stuff when you're evaluating your actions, but that's up to you. Through monitoring, we can also know when the right time to control pests is. So we're looking at different life stages of our pests. When we're looking at insects, different life stages, whether it's an immature insect or an adult, or maybe it's a pupa or an egg, they might be susceptible to different types of controls. Like the adult might be completely tolerant of whatever action you take, whereas the eggs are really susceptible. So we want to know what life stage of pest we have out there, so we know when is the appropriate time to apply that control action. And monitoring also helps us evaluate. So it helps us know, did the actions that we took into place, the products that we applied, the stuff that we bought and put on the plants, whatever, did that actually work? Did it reduce the pests below our threshold level? So here's some steps in pest monitoring. Well, first you want to find the pest. So you want to be out there looking. Once you find the pest, you want to identify it. And you have a lot of resources for this. There are great field guides. There are some online resources, and you have your extension agent. If you're not a Fulton County resident, you can reach out to your county office, and your extension service is a resource for you for identifying any pests. So feel free to bring them in a baggie, in a container, or just send pictures. But again, identification is super important. You also want to identify the life stage that that insect is at. You want to note the location where you found that insect. How many other insect pests were there with it? So, were there 100 aphids? Were there 2 aphids? Something like that. You want to take stock of the environment surrounding your pests. So what are the other plants that are around? And part of that is if you take some sort of control action, you want to know if that action is going to affect the other plants nearby. You also want to be looking out for beneficial insects. So you want to see, are there a lot of pollinators out? What time of day are they out there? Am I seeing predators and parasitoids? Just take stock of the other things that are happening nearby in the environment. You also want to identify key hosts for your plant, for your pests. So these would be like preferred host plants for whatever pest you have. An example is if you are using trap crops, a pretty famous trap crop is blue Hubbard squash for squash bugs and other squash pests. They just love that variety of squash. So you can use that as a trap to lure them away from your crops and then dispose of that plant somehow or destroy it. But that would be a key host. So those plants that are preferred by certain pests, you're going to want to know which plants those are so you can really be looking out. Those can sort of be like your early warning plants for a certain pest. You want to identify existing damage from the pest. So take stock of what damage you're seeing out there. And knowing the biology and the ecology of your pest, you can match it up and say, yes, I know that this pest does this type of damage. And again, you want to write all of this down. You might think that you're going to remember, a couple months down the road when you saw what pest and where, but you're not going to remember. So just write it down so you have really good records, because that'll help with making your system more efficient. Okay, so let's say we have our pest, we have identified it, and we've decided that it met our threshold. So it's already at our threshold where we need to do something to prevent our economic losses. So we want to determine our goal. We've already put into place some preventative measures, perhaps. So we want to suppress, that's our goal. So we want to learn what control tactics are available. Again, Extension has a lot of great resources for this. We have a ton of publications, but there are also great books, other great resources online. So find out what are effective controls for that pest at that life stage. And then you want to evaluate the benefits and risks of your different control tactics. Given your constraints, maybe your economic constraints, maybe what you are willing to do in your garden or on your farm, maybe the environment that's surrounding it. You want to take all that into account when you're deciding what control tactics to use. And you also want to choose the most effective and least harmful strategy that you can. This balance is going to be up to you. It's going to depend on your constraints. You also want to use each tactic in the strategy correctly. There are a lot of wrong ways to do things. This is especially true with pesticides. So if you are using a narrow spectrum targeted pesticide, you want to make sure that you're following all the label directions, and we'll get into that later. But even if you're just using row covers, for example, to keep insects out, you want to make sure that they are really secured all the way around so that pests aren't able to get through them. Maybe you want to make sure there's no holes in your netting, etc. And then, of course, you want to observe local, state, and federal regulations. And again, this is sort of most important when it comes to pesticides. You want to be following the label, which is sort of a legal binding agreement. Okay, so we've sort of talked about the big concepts of IPM, the approach. These are the actual tools that you have in your toolbox. So we've got natural controls. These are just things in the environment that we have no control over. So it might be like the late frost that we had in December, maybe a freeze event that wipes out a lot of insects. It could be maybe you're next to mountains that will stop movement of pests, or maybe you're next to a large pond that's going to inhibit movement of pests. The just sort of natural things that are out of our control would be natural controls that do exist. Host resistance, these are going to be resistant plant varieties. Cultural controls, again, are ways that we can modify the environment to make the environment less favorable for pests to live and reproduce and all that. Mechanical controls are going to be physically keeping insects off of plants or physically destroying insects. Sanitation is super important. This is cleaning up crop residues that maybe were harboring pests, maybe have disease symptoms, so they might have fungal spores, just removing hiding places and materials that will harbor pests. Chemical controls, again, these are pesticides. They are a tool in the toolbox that we can use judiciously. And biological controls. These are organisms that will kill our pests for us. So we're going to get into it. Host plant resistance is a super powerful tool. It's most effective for diseases. So you see the most resistant varieties that have resistance traits for diseases, but there are some that are resistant to certain insects. And they accomplish this in a few ways. They might prevent the pest from completing their life cycle. They might just be more vigorous, so more robust in their growth habit. And so, they're healthier and more robust, so they can tolerate more feeding and still put out, an acceptable yield. They might just be more difficult to attack. I've seen some varieties of squash that were bred to have like longer, denser hairs on the undersides of the leaves. And that prevents some small soft-bodied insects from actually being able to get to the leaf surface to feed. So things like that can effectively be resistant when they're just physically making it harder for insects to get to those plants. So if you have disease problems, I highly, highly encourage you to look for resistant varieties. This is one of the most effective preventative tools that we have. So seed companies like Johnny's have bred a ton of different resistance traits in different crops for different types of pests. So just look out for this. This is a really cost-effective and efficient way to suppress pests. We've got our cultural controls. This is a huge catch-all category, and a lot of these things are preventative. So they could be altering the environment. So crop rotation is a good example of that. We're moving crops from place to place around our space from year to year. And that means that if we're not growing the same crop in the same place every year, we don't have pests associated with those crops building up in that specific area. So crop rotation is very effective for pest management. We can also alter the condition of the host plant. So like I said, a healthy plant is a strong and resistant plant. So we want to be giving that plant the things that it needs. We want to be fertilizing it correctly, providing the right amount of irrigation and the right amount of sunlight so that it can be as healthy and resistant naturally as it possibly can. If we're talking about weeds, weeds are a pest. So I guess this would fall more under altering the environment. Cultivation or tilling is a great way to manage weeds as well. We can also alter the behavior of the pest through various methods. So here are some examples of common cultural practices. We can select our site based on how conducive it is to certain pests. Crop rotation, of course, is an awesome thing that we want to do. Cultivating soil, if you have weed pressure or if you have maybe like soil dwelling beetle grubs or other soil dwelling pests, cultivating soil is an option. This might not be the option for you if you're going for a no-till system. So again, you just sort of have to balance some of these things depending on what your constraints are. We can vary the time of planting or harvesting to sort of dodge peak pest populations depending on what pest we're talking about. There's only so much wiggle room here, but this can be really effective. So for example, we can grow here in Georgia, we can grow squash. We can do a spring crop of squash and we can do a fall crop of squash. We tend to see way worse whitefly pressure in fall grown squash. So we can focus all of our energy on our spring grown squash, or we can maybe try and grow squash a little bit earlier in the fall before whitefly populations have really, really built up. We can plant trap crops, like I mentioned. Blue Hubbard squash is a really good example, but there are some others you can look into. Adjusting plant spacing, pruning, and thinning is going to be really important for reducing plant disease. And what we're doing here is improving airflow. So if we move plants farther apart, if we're making sure to prune and thin them, then we have more airflow and less fungal pressure. And again, we want to have correct irrigation, fertilization, sunlight, etc., so we can have the healthiest plants that we possibly can. We can also destroy alternate hosts. A lot of insects will actually use weeds as alternate host plants. So they'll feed or reproduce on weeds when their preferred crop plants are not in season or not available. So if we can identify what weeds act as alternate hosts for a given pest, we can target those weeds as well. We can try to remove those weeds so our insect pest doesn't have as many other places to go to complete its life cycle or to feed. Sanitation, I mentioned, is like very simple, but very important. And it's just removing food and shelter sources. So a big example of this is removing crop residues at the end of the cropping season. So your dead plants, your leaves that might have dropped down into the field, you want to get that stuff out of the field, both for insect pests that might overwinter in that plant material, or for disease, where fungal spores and bacteria can also harbor in those crop residues. So again, if you're doing a no-till system, you're going to have to balance some of this, but in general, your pest pressure will go down if you're removing those crop residues. Some things like slugs and snails like to hang out in like under pots. and debris that's piled up in sort of shady and moist areas. So we can really cut down on slug pressure by removing stuff that's in the field or near the garden, like stacks of pots. And then things like leaf miners, these are typically fly larvae that are mining in between the upper and lower cuticle of the leaf. If we see that there is some leaf miner larvae that are in these leaves, we can remove those leaves and take them away or destroy them, and that's going to suppress our pest population as well. We've got our mechanical or physical controls. These are also like super simple. You know, it's not like, doesn't take a rocket scientist to know that if you just cover up your plants, then insects can't get to them. But this is super, super effective. So things like screens and netting, some sort of barrier. You can also bag individual fruit, which is super time consuming and labor intensive, but potentially feasible if you have something that's going to get to whatever your marketable crop is. Fans are really effective in high tunnels. And pheromone traps, baited and pheromone traps can also be super effective. Also, just physically destroying eggs or larvae is considered physical or mechanical control. So these are our squash bug eggs. They're pretty distinctive looking, sort of oblong and bronze. If you see these and you know that they're squash bug eggs, just squash them. That's going to help control your population. If you see a tomato hornworm on your tomato plants, you can physically pluck that caterpillar off, throw it to the chickens. They will go absolutely nuts. That's, you know, hand picking insects is a physical control. Biological control. This is a sort of a bigger, more complex topic, but really interesting. And this is using our natural enemies. So parasites and parasitoids, predator insects, and pathogens to kill our pests for us. So we've got some cool predators like lacewing larvae. This guy is eating some whitefly nymphs. A lot of wasps are great predators of caterpillars. They actually pick up these caterpillars, take them back to their nests to feed to their larvae. And then lady beetles, of course, are predators both at their larval stage and their adult stage. So both this larva and this adult are both feeding on aphids. The deal with biological control is that it takes time to build up this sort of cohort of predators and parasitoids. You know, these are living things. I'll talk in a minute about buying commercially available natural enemies, but you know, these are living things. So it's going to take a little while. This is not an immediate solution. Some really common natural enemies that we're likely to see are lots of different types of beetles, lady beetles, ground beetles. If you live in a sandy soil area, you might see tiger beetles. Different types of predatory flies. So syrphid flies are also known as flower flies or hover flies. Long-legged flies are really cool. They're teeny, teeny, tiny. You would never think that they are predators, but they are. Robber flies are like the apex predators of the insect world. We've got a lot of predatory true bugs. So they're in the same order. They're relatives of stink bugs and aphids and other things that we do consider pests, but they're actually predators. So spined soldier bugs, damsel bugs, minute pirate bugs, predaceous plant bugs, assassin bugs. These are all true bugs. We've got our green and brown lacewings. The adults are not predators. They mostly feed on nectar, but the larvae, which I have in this photo, this is a larva of a lacewing. Those guys are the predators. And then, of course, we've got our parasitoids, which are mostly wasps and flies. So a lot of people want to buy commercially available natural enemies on the internet or wherever and release them. And this can be really effective if you're in an enclosed system. So if you're in a high tunnel or you're in a greenhouse, this can be effective because those predators or those parasitoids are going to stay in that environment. But there are some caveats to this approach. If you're in an open air environment, a lot of times there's not enough prey for the amount of predators that you're releasing. So if you're releasing like 200 ladybugs, chances are there aren't enough aphids to support that number of adult ladybugs in your system right where you release them. So like a lot of them are just going to fly away, and you're losing some money, you're losing efficacy. The other thing is that these guys were raised under laboratory conditions. They were reared in laboratory colonies. And so they're not exactly the most resilient of individual insects. They grew up under consistent temperatures, humidity, light, etc. So when we release them into our Georgia environment where temperatures are fluctuating, maybe it's raining, there's predators out there, the humidity is wild, a lot of them are just going to die. So a more sustainable way to go is to actually support and attract predators and parasitoids that are already occurring in your system. So we can bring them and retain them to our garden or our farmscape by giving them some of the things that they need. And it turns out they need the same basic things that we do. They need food, water, and shelter. So their food sources, they're going to need some prey. So this is another reason why you don't want to take the nuclear option and just eradicate all pests, because our beneficial insects need something to feed on. So we want to keep sort of low levels of pest populations around, or be okay with that, in order to support our predators and parasitoids. We can also provide flowering plants, which if you were in the webinar last week, I think I called them insect Red Bull, which is what they are. So we can provide flowers to give our insects a little energy boost so they can go out and feed on pests. We can provide water. So bird bath is a great option. You can make like what they call a butterfly puddle, which is just a more shallow bird bath. Or even just rocks in the environment that will capture a little bit of water can act as a water source for insects. And in terms of shelter, we're just talking about natural materials, so variation in the depths, heights, textures of our plants and natural materials. So it might be a log pile, maybe you left a pile of leaves somewhere. These are all things that act as shelter or hiding places for our predators and parasitoids. We also want to choose selective rather than broad spectrum insecticides. So we just want to target our pest insect. We don't want to affect our natural enemies. And when we're out there monitoring for our pests, we want to take stock of our beneficials, which I talked about a little bit earlier. Okay, we're getting close to time, so I'm gonna just pick it up. Chemical control is a tool in the toolbox, and this means using pesticides to destroy pests, control their activity, or prevent them from causing damage. And we do have some really great and safe products that can be used. So Dipel is a trade name for Bacillus thuringiensis, or BT. Many of you are probably familiar with BT. It's actually a bacterium that gets consumed by caterpillars and kills them, but it only works on caterpillars. It does, if it's consumed by humans, by any other insect, it's not going to do anything. It's very targeted to caterpillars. So this is a really great option for pests like cabbage looper, tomato hornworms, all the millions of caterpillar pests that we have. There are other bacillus options for beetle grubs and for mosquitoes. So those mosquito dunks are usually, I think they're like BT Kerstaki, or I can't remember, but anyway, there's different BT for different types of insects. Neem oil is less targeted, so it's less specific. It will take care of things like caterpillars, beetles, aphids, a variety of insects, but it's fairly safe. And then something like a Castile soapy water spray is really effective for soft-bodied pests. And of course, it's just soapy water. It's not going to harm us. We want to know a little bit about the active ingredient of any pesticide that we're applying and how it works. So like Castile soap, if we make a soapy water spray and neem oil and we spray them on the plant, we need to actually coat the insect, because it's that physical contact that's going to have the negative reaction that we want. Whereas something like BT needs to be consumed by the insect. So for something like soap, if you spray it all over the plant, and it dries, and then an insect comes by and walks on it later, it's not going to do anything. You have to actually contact the insect. So it's helpful to know how our different products work. UGA has some great resources. The Georgia Pest Management Handbook, we have two options. We have the commercial edition, which is 2 volumes. It's like 2 massive books. These are for people that have a commercial pesticide applicator's license and can buy restricted pesticides. We also have the home and garden edition, which is for anybody who just wants to buy things at, the local garden center. The chapters from these books are available online as PDFs. So just Google Georgia Pest Management Handbook, and there is a ton of really useful information. For every pest and crop, it's going to tell you what pesticides or pesticidal products are labeled in Georgia for that pest. And it's going to have a lot of other super useful information, especially the commercial edition has established thresholds for different crop and pest combinations. So this is a really, really good resource. I would definitely check it out. When you're deciding when and where to apply pesticides, you always want to follow the label directions. The label is the law. You enter into this legally binding agreement that you're going to follow everything on the label when you buy the pesticide. So follow the label directions in terms of how much to apply, what plants and what pests you can apply it to, what personal protective equipment you need to wear, everything on the label you need to follow. And the label tells you the most effective way to apply the pesticide as well. So the rates and things that are listed, those are the most effective rates. So that's another reason to follow them. Not only are they the safest, but they're the most effective. You want to apply pesticides at the life stage of the pest that's going to be susceptible to that product. Again, you want to only treat your intended target if possible. You want to select the most narrow spectrum product that you can and make the most targeted physical application that you can. So that goes to our treat the correct area. You don't want to make a spray application in windy weather, which is going to take your product off target. First of all, you're going to lose efficacy for what you're trying to do, but then you're introducing a pesticide somewhere else where you don't need it. So rainy weather, windy weather, those are sort of the big ones where you don't want to apply pesticides. Or if it's going to rain like in an hour or in a couple hours, maybe rethink when you're going to make that application. Okay, so let's say you applied a pesticide and it didn't work. There could be a lot of factors that played into it. Did you actually identify your pest correctly? Maybe you thought it was something else, and this pesticide doesn't work for what you actually have. Maybe you applied too much of the product or too little. Maybe you applied it to a life stage of the insect that's not susceptible to that product. Or maybe the conditions were wrong and it moved your pesticide off target. This too hot or cold is important for our plant health. So sometimes if it's too hot for a certain pesticide, when we apply that to the plant can actually suffer damage because of that. And then pesticide resistance is a reality. Maybe you did everything right, all the conditions were right, you have a susceptible life stage, all that, but it still didn't work. It could be that you have a population of thrips or aphids or whatever that's resistant to that pesticide. That is a real thing that is happening, and it's a huge problem. So that's why people tell you if you're going to apply pesticides repeatedly, you want to rotate different modes of action and different active ingredients so we can prevent resistance from developing. Okay, again, the label is the law. It tells you everything about where and how you can apply that pesticide, what PPE you need to wear, and how to store and dispose of it. All right, I'm going to recap here. The goals of IPM are to use many complementary strategies to achieve this sort of sustainable and resilient pest management and suppression. We want to have biodiversity in our system. So we want to grow different types of plants, different varieties of plants, We want to have low levels of pest population so that we can support lots of different natural enemies in the system as well. So a more diverse system is going to be a more resilient system. We want to be out there scouting and monitoring regularly and in sort of a measurable way so that we can detect problems early and evaluate whether what we did worked. We want to start with our non-chemical controls first. So our mechanical and our cultural methods first that will sort of be preventative. And if chemicals are needed, we want to use them as a last resort, and we want to choose the least toxic products that are going to be most pest specific. So we want to apply pesticides very judiciously, and knowing that they're going to work for just the pests that we're looking to control. All right, that's it for content. I know I just like blah, blah, blabbed for the entire time, but we have an in-person insect scouting workshop coming up for our commercial growers or producers and community garden leaders. Coming up this Sunday, June 11th, we will teach you how to put into effect some of those scouting and monitoring methods so that you can use them in your community garden or on your farm. This is going to be at Camp Fulton Truett 4-H Educational Center in College Park, and it's going to be super fun from 1 to 4 p.m. So please scan this QR code if you're interested. It's free. We just ask that you are a commercial producer or a community garden leader. And feel free to share this with anybody that you think might be interested. So I'm going to go ahead and switch it. And I just want to thank you all so much for the opportunity to talk about this. This is probably my second favorite topic to talk about after insect identification, which we did last week. But if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to email me. Here's the number to our North Fulton Extension office. It's easier to get in contact with me through email, but you're also welcome to call and leave a message as well. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Awesome, awesome. Gabrielle, there are a few questions here in the chat, and I can just kind of read them aloud if that works.
Yeah, that'd be perfect.
So I see, and for everyone who was asking, yes, we definitely will share the recordings of this webinar as well as the previous webinar if you didn't get that one as well. Okay, so Gabrielle, question for you. Are there action threshold standards for farmers to use as a baseline to compare their pest populations? Is that data collected or research bunch?
That is a really good question. Yes, there are established thresholds for a lot of crop insect combinations that have been developed through research from university researchers. The problem is that, one, these are mostly for row crops, so things like cotton, peanuts, grains, because those systems are more standardized and they're on a larger scale. So there are fewer factors that will play into coming up with that threshold. We do have thresholds for vegetable crops, but again, it's going to be region specific. So if you find a publication from Michigan that says this is how you scout for, tomato hornworm, this is going to be your threshold, that threshold is going to be different in Georgia because we have a lot of different constraints. So in preparation for this talk, I wanted to know how many established thresholds are there for just like vegetable pests. For a gardener, there aren't really any. You're going to have to come up with them based on your own system and what level of damage you can tolerate. For a farmer, there are some, and you will find them in the Georgia Pest Management Handbook. So just do a little digging. If you have a question about a specific pest, how to scout and monitor for that pest and what the threshold might be, shoot me an email or your county agent. Again, it gets complicated because there's going to be a different threshold for every pest crop combination, and it's going to vary by your system, how large your system is, and what region of the country you're in. So there's a lot of factors that go into it, but there are some depending on what you're growing.
Awesome. Thank you. A couple more questions. There's a question here that Nolithia actually answered, but I think it'd be good to just answer it aloud. Are there people at the UGA Fulton County office to answer my gardening questions? If I go down there, who do I contact? Do I need to make an appointment? Can I bring in plant samples?
Absolutely. I can't see what Norlethia's answer was from my screen now, but if you go to the South office, which is in East Point, you don't need to make an appointment if you just have a question. You can just go in. I think it's easier to email one of us. We have two ag agents, myself and James Herron, and Norlethia is our educator. She is also answering questions on the help desk. So you can email any of us. You can stop by the office up in the North office where Norlethia and I are. We are in the office less. There are a lot fewer people there. So sometimes the office is closed because we're out and about in the community. But I would say email us first. For sampling, we do tons of different types of sampling, including plant samples. So just shoot us an email and we can give you some specific instructions for how to package your plant sample, what part you need to bring in, and all that, so we can coordinate to make sure that your sample gets sent out.
Awesome. Thank you. And you see the contact information here on the screen as well. Another question, can you spray BT prophylaxis? Prophylaxis?
Yes, you can. You would have to look at the specific product to see how early you can spray it, how long it's going to last in the field. That depends on the inert ingredients that are in the product, which can vary by brand name. You don't want to spray it too early because typically our organic pesticides don't last as long. They don't have what we call very good residual activity. So the synthetic pesticides are going to last longer. They're going to be more effective for longer in the field. Organic pesticides tend to break down pretty quickly. So again, you want to meet your threshold level for whatever caterpillar pest you have before you spray, so that you're not wasting your money. You're not applying pesticides where they're not needed. So again, I would take the monitoring approach first, but because it's going to be consumed by the caterpillars, yes, you can spray it ahead of time. You just have to check the label to see how long it's going to be effective.
Awesome. How effective do you think diatomaceous earth is?
Diatomaceous earth can be super effective for soft-bodied insects and other pests. So things that don't have a really, really tough exoskeleton. Something like a beetle that has like a really tough chitinous exoskeleton, diatomaceous earth isn't going to do anything, because what it does is it desiccates them. So it's going to be best for things that have sort of, we call them soft-bodied pests. So things like mites, aphids, thrips, whiteflies, which tend to be the little things. Caterpillars are soft-bodied, slugs. You also want to apply when it's going to be dry, because it's a powder, so it's going to become ineffective when it gets wet. So under really moist conditions, or if it's going to rain like later that day, I wouldn't apply it, because I mean, it's not going to do anything. You're just wasting your money. So just be sort of judicious about when and where you apply it. But yeah, you can sort of make a little ring around your plants. And like if you have slugs or pill bug problems, roly-polies, them crawling over the diatomaceous earth can be effective.
Awesome. Awesome. A couple more questions here. We have someone in the chat saying that they've been attempting to hand remove their aphids, and they've used the soapy water method that you're speaking of, but are afraid that they will kill off some ladybugs or beneficial insects. So will the ladybugs be eradicated as well with the soap treatment?
That's a good question. I think probably not. The adult lady beetles, definitely not. They're good to go. Soapy water is not going to affect them because they have a really, really tough exoskeleton. The larvae are more soft bodied, so I would try to avoid them if possible. You can, like, if you see one, you can relocate it and then move it back later, or just right after you spray. Because, like I mentioned, soapy water, you have to actually spray it on the bug for it to be effective. If you just spray it on the plant and the bug contacts it later, it's not going to do anything. So what I recommend, soapy water is what I use for aphids in my garden, because aphids are going to be a continuous pest. They're just going to be there every single year. If we do some of these other preventative background things and support our beneficials, we might have lower populations, but I'm probably going to end up spraying a lot of my plants with soapy water throughout the year. So what I do is I really douse that plant with soapy water on the top, on the undersides of the leaves, on the stems, anywhere that I see those aphids. And then I do that like 3 or 4 days in a row. So once a day for like 4 days in a row. And that means that any that were hiding in a crevice somewhere, you might contact them the next day when you make the spray. So the ratio you want is 1 tablespoon of Castile soap to 1 quart of water. And I'll tell you, put the water in the spray bottle before you put the tablespoon of soap. I learned that one the hard way. But that's the right ratio. And I would stay away from using like dish soap detergents, because they can affect the cuticle of your plant. Not always, but Castile soap is a little more, I don't know, it doesn't affect the cuticle as badly. So that's my advice for soapy water.
All right, awesome. And then final question I see here, ants, friend or foe? And then there's a
Oh,
follow-up question on the ants. I've heard that aphids work for ants. So if you don't remove the ants, it'll be hard to get rid of the aphids.
actually, it's the other way around. I love this question. If you see ants like crawling around your vegetable plants, you probably have an aphid problem. And that's because the ants farm the aphids. So the aphids are feeding on, they're basically feeding on sugar water coming out of the leaves. So they just feed on the cell contents, and up on the leaves, that's where the plant is producing sugars through photosynthesis. So they don't have a lot of like fiber and protein going in. So what they poop out is also just like sugar water. And the ants like to eat that excrement, which we call honeydew, kind of cute name. And so the ants know that if they're around the aphids, they can get a reliable food source from this aphid excrement, honeydew. So they actually like defend the aphids from other predators. So if you see a lot of ants, you probably have aphids. They're just farming the aphids, because the ants aren't really they're not gonna feed on your plant usually. If you're talking about other types of ants, a lot of times they fall into that annoyance pest category, like fire ants. Like fire ants probably aren't going to kill you. They're probably not spreading disease or like eating your plants, but they sting you, which like is an annoyance. So there are ways to control pest ants. But if we're talking about vegetables, they typically are associated with aphids. So just look a little bit closer and see if you see green aphids somewhere that you missed them before.
Okay. All right. I think that sums up the questions that I see. If anyone else has any additional questions, and I see plenty of testimonies here about how amazing UGA extension is. So definitely encourage everyone to stay engaged and reach out to both Gabrielle and Olithia. And as well, we encourage everyone to attend, or everyone that is able and garden or farm operator or manager, to attend this Sunday's insect identification workshop. All right, and it's there's limited seating, so please, we encourage everyone to register ahead of time. And there's also another opportunity to engage with Georgia Organics On June 27th, Georgia Organics is having a farmer field day where they'll be going over some integrated pest management workshop on farm in New Bern, Georgia at Crystal Organic Farm. And I'm going to put both of these links in the chat for everyone to click and access. All right, boom, they're in the chat now. And again, as always, we will be sharing these resources with everyone. So we thank you all. And please, we encourage everyone to take the exit survey so that we can continue to bring you these webinars and make it better each time. So we thank you all so much for your time. We're about 11 minutes over, but we truly appreciate you. Thank you so much, Gabrielle. And we look forward to seeing you on Sunday.
Thank you, Justin. And thanks everybody for showing out.
Goodbye, y'all.